So you've been waiting for it and asking for it, and it's here. The cross-console comparison of Assassin's Creed Valhalla on Xbox Series S, X, and PS5. To talk about this very interesting cross-comparison analysis here, I'm joined by my resident friend and colleague, John Linneman. How you doing there, John?
Pretty good, Alex. I mean, I guess Audie wasn't available as our helpful Norwegian friend, so I'm going to have to tackle this instead. And yeah, so we've both been playing some of this game. I managed to make it a little bit further than you, but you've been sitting there. We've heard some interesting info about that, and yeah, let's put it to the test.
Yeah, I think before we get there, though, to the immediate kind of cross comparisons here, it's good to talk a little bit about the game first, because this is, another iteration of this Anvil Next engine in Assassin's Creed, and we're getting, I think, a pretty good overall graphical package here on the next-gen consoles, and I've been playing on Series S, X, and PS5, and we get, the usual, I think, really great-looking things that this engine has done for quite a while now, like the volumetric sky in the game, generally really large terrain, and I think one of the better things that they've done in this kind of version of the game engine is that we have snow found at least across the whole Scandinavian map that you start the game at, and it uses this really nice snow tessellation that can move around the snow and see it displace underneath your character, and I think it works really well.
But what is great, and something we've been asking for years, they finally added per object motion blur. That's right, object blur is here. We've complained about it for a long time, and it looks good. What do you think, Alex?
I think it's pretty excellent. They, Assassin's Creed games have always been pretty great looking, and I always thought they kind of were just missing that fluidity of motion, especially on consoles where they were targeting 30 FPS originally. And here they added per object motion blur. It seems to be enabled across all platforms, and it just applies to characters and moving objects, and doesn't actually seem to have any sort of real camera motion blur in the game.
It does not have it, I can confirm. Having tested with black frame insertion and on a CRT, there is zero motion blur on the camera, which is great because, camera blur can be distracting sometimes, but per object motion blur, that's what we're talking about when we say we love motion blur, and it does look good here.
It looks pretty great here. I like it. Getting into the graphical quality of all these games, I've noticed that the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X are using the exact same graphical quality presets across my testing. And by that, I mean like the way the effects look, the distance of geometry, level of detail changing, and things like that. So character level of detail looks the exact same on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, which I tested by moving backwards and forwards here and just checking when this character model would change in the distance. And it is the exact same on both consoles. Tessellation distance is the exact same on both consoles, which you can see here when moving backwards and forwards and seeing little tessellation spike on the ground, kind of rendering in and out at the exact same time on both consoles. Resolution for shadows is the same. The distance at which tree and terrain LOD changes are the exact same, which you can see in this shot here, kind of in slow motion, where the horses are at the exact same distance in this shot here, and the tree changes its LOD at the exact same time. Basically, these games look very, very similar from a graphical effects perspective, and I've seen kind of rumor mongering across the web that there's tiny differences between them. In all honesty, I think if you're seeing differences between these games from a visual effects perspective, it might just be because there's different scenarios like time of day differences, or maybe it's just a bug, which, this game has bugs. So it could be something like that.
And it is interesting to see them because for this game, we'll talk about performance later, but this is the first time they've targeted 60 frames per second on consoles. When Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag launched for PS4 and Xbox One, they focused primarily on adding a lot of visual flourishes to this. Whereas this case, it's pretty much still visually on par with the Xbox One X and PS4 Pro version. Overall, it's just about bumping up performance. But that doesn't mean there isn't one difference on the next-gen console. There's Xbox Series S as well, right?
Yeah, Series S does have some similarities, like the character LOD range is the exact same as Series X and PS5. Tessellation distance is also the exact same, but it does have some lower things, like the shadow resolution across the entire world is generally lower. So if you look at shadows on the ground, like you can see here, you'll see that they're more diffuse. And this wouldn't really actually be a big deal when you're just like traversing across the terrain, but it would technically mean that like random conversations in the open world will have like worse shadows, and you'll be able to notice it there. Another difference is that the LOD distance is kind of brought in much closer to the camera. So that means geometry changes in front of the camera to lower quality versions much quicker. And this is the most, I would say, the largest difference between all the versions beyond their performance, is that on Series S, you can definitely see the LEDs flickering in and out much more easily, even though it's targeting a lower frame rate.
It seems more noticeable for sure.
In terms of loading, this is the usual next-gen upgrade, basically. It's loading okay, but not as fast as other games, I would say. I basically loaded up the exact same save using the cross-save ability that Ubisoft allows, and found out that PlayStation 5 loads the quickest at 23:30, and then Xbox Series X just a little more than 3 seconds thereafter at 26:48, and then Series S as the slowest with 27:17. The differences there make me wonder if it's really the SSD speed difference here, or actually if it's just CPU limited in some way, given the slight difference between Series S and X. You know, I think everyone's here for the big discussion of resolution and frame rate, because, one of the first cross comparisons of this generation. And honestly, when playing this game and you put them back to back, I've been playing the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, they basically have the same visual makeup in terms of resolution. They're both running at dynamic resolution using this temporal upsampling method that Assassin's Creed games have used since, I think, at least Origins.
Yeah, I think that's where they introduced that.
It's going down to 1440p and presumably up to 4K, targeting 60 FPS. I say presumably 4K because I actually didn't really ever get any counts of a real 4K when doing this.
Yeah, it doesn't seem... It gets close, I think, but it doesn't actually seem to really hit that native 4K, and that's fine.
That's fine,
This is a good choice. Dynamic resolution scaling works pretty well here, especially with that 60 FPS target. Xbox Series S is more interesting in that it kind of reveals some, I guess, disappointing elements here.
Yeah, I think the disappointment is that even though it's targeting, a lower 30 FPS on Xbox Series S, it does, scale lower than the other consoles as well. I counted at its lowest, at the worst spot, where I would see PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X bottoming out at 1440p, I would count at such places on Series S 1188p, so slightly above 1080p.
That would have been completely acceptable if it was targeting 60 frames per second like its bigger brothers.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, it could go up, though, in places where there's not a lot happening and you're just kind of like staring like I am right here, to around 1656p, so slightly above 1440p in a very calm area where there's not a lot happening.
1656p, everybody's favorite resolution.
Yeah, I think it's just any of the variable counts that you'll get from the dynamic resolution. In terms of actually, I counted at least 10 separate occasions across the entire game on Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5, and they all returned in these areas basically the exact same resolution count. In an area where I'd see 1440p on Xbox Series X, I'd get that on PS5 as well. There was only one scene where I saw the PS5 returning a higher resolution, which is right here, where on PS5 I was getting 1728p while kind of fighting around this area, and I was getting 1440p on Xbox Series X. So they generally look very, very similar, actually, just with slightly, I guess, the propensity to have a higher res. You'll have a higher chance of that on PS5, perchance.
But then on Series S, then, it seems like it kind of hangs a little bit above 1440p often enough. But as soon as the action ramps up, it drops down to like 1296p, I think you said.
Yeah.
And even lower than that in some cases. So
one thing to really point out in this game, it is using a dynamic 4K, and it is upscaling in, like a reconstructed manner. But for me, in comparison to other games that I've seen using this reconstruction methods and with like a dynamic res, I found it very easy to notice the resolution in this game and also count the resolution in comparison to other games where we usually have a really hard time counting resolution sometimes in games that use dynamic res and a ton of post-processing and also upscaling. So to me, the game looks good, but I wouldn't know if I'd say it looks 4K-ish all the time, because it is actually hanging around in action scenes pretty often around 1440p on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. A bigger reason why it is hanging around 1440p so often in such more hectic scenes is because the games are targeting 60 FPS, and, at least on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. And that's where we're going to get over now to the performance section of this video. In general, I think both consoles are doing a pretty okay job at hitting 60 FPS, but one of the things I noticed right away is that they're both not doing it as well as I would like in some ways. And I think it has to do with the resolution scaling either being set too high, like so it's scaling up to too high of a resolution too often, or it's not being aggressive enough to bring the resolution down when it needs to. So you'll notice this right when you start the game on both consoles, that you can see a tiny tear occurring rather often in cutscenes or in gameplay when just something like the camera angle changes. And on both Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5, if you move the camera up and down, looking at the sky and then looking at the ground, you can see that the game will drop a frame and tear on both consoles.
See, that makes me think that it's like a threshold issue. Conceivably, you would say, okay, when the game reaches like X number of milliseconds, like we'll say like 12 milliseconds, then start to drop the res until you hit a certain point. But it almost seems like it's just not set low enough.
Yeah.
And so the game takes too long to catch up, so you get a tear.
Yeah, that's what it feels like to me. And as a result of that, both games will end up tearing when the scene changes more quickly. That's when you'll start noticing the tears. And the thing, though, is that they'll both be tearing in cutscenes actually to a similar degree, but Xbox Series X definitely tears more often, and those tears spend more time in the middle of the screen, which generally means that the Xbox Series X is performing lower. It has a
big time,
lower performance, and this can, it depends on the scene to scene. It's not easy to always catch tears using our software, especially on PlayStation platforms for certain reasons. But we've done some back-to-back testing here. For example, in this scene right here, you just fight this boss and you're about to go outside. When you do this on Xbox Series X, the game drops to its lowest resolution when the door opens, and you're tearing constantly as this is happening, and you're inside this hut and you can go outside. But while this is happening, the frame rate is around 50 to 53 on Xbox Series X, and you're just constantly seeing full screen tearing. Go over to PS5, PS5 drops down to that same 1440p lowest bound resolution, but is a flat 60. No tearing whatsoever in this scene right here. So it's running quite a bit better on PS5.
Having played further in both versions, I find that that's actually rather consistent. In general, the PS5 version does a really good job of hitting its 60 target during gameplay. It does seem to crop up in some of the conversation cutscene situations.
Yeah.
But during gameplay, it's shockingly stable.
It's quite a bit better. And I do find this full screen tearing very obvious when it's happening, because it's literally just the entire screen tearing.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
In this scene here, though, on Xbox Series S, when the door opened, there was a slight drop in the frame rate for a split second and a slight tear, because the Xbox Series S will also tear in such moments.
Great.
But it then immediately recovered to a perfectly fine 30 FPS with just a very low resolution, a little bit above 1080p. So I would say Series S in general has more consistent performance at its 30 FPS than Xbox Series X has at its 60 FPS in general when playing the game. Another thing that happens on Series X is that when kind of that shows off this issue is every single time you'll take out your torch and the time of day is just right so that the torch has shadows enabled on it. Series X will drop frames like you can see in this shot here, and it does it pretty heavily. Xbox Series X, when I took out my torch here, and the Sigurd character also has his torch out, full screen tearing the entire time during the sequence, and it's dropping to the mid to upper 40s, which in my humble opinion, that's not a very good 60 FPS.
No.
PS5, on the other hand, in that exact same scene, doing the exact same thing, it is tearing at the top of the screen and dropping some frames, going down to the mid to upper 50s, but where the tears are occurring, it's much less distracting, I would say, and it's just happening less often. And it's definitely hitting 60 more often than the Series X is. Series X is performing 15% worse in this scene than the PS5 while both are dropping. And that's not very good, actually,
Yeah, I mean, I would describe the PS5 version as being pretty much a stable 60 FPS experience with occasional little dips, the kind of thing you would expect on consoles.
Yeah,
but
right?
Series X definitely needs some work, this version of the game, because if you're playing on a normal display, the tearing is extremely distracting. Like, it's just not good enough. But I think that's why it's worth mentioning, if you do happen to have a display that supports variable rate refresh or variable refresh rate, it kind of solves the problem, which is kind of interesting. So I played it on the LG CX with VRR enabled, and it basically looks perfect. There's no tearing. Most of the dips are almost imperceptible to the eye. It just looks really, really good. And it's really, truly a game-changing kind of thing. But the problem is, obviously, you can't expect people to go invest in a new display just to solve problems like this. This is still on the developer.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Work needs to be done because the vast majority of people are going to be playing it without VRR and experiencing tons of tearing.
My recommendation here is if they can't fix it by doing, some sort of behind-the-scenes optimizations, that the game possibly on Xbox Series X needs a lower resolution bound. It drops down to 1440p, but that's probably not low enough in that aspect. So maybe that's a way to fix it. Xbox Series S, like I said, quite a bit better at hitting its 30 FPS target, even though it is lower resolution, and you'll get an occasional tear, but it's pretty rare. It's, I would say, almost just as rare as a tear in normal gameplay on PS5. The game, though, in general, playing it, there is some weirdness going on here on Xbox Series consoles. The game does have some bugs. John's posted on Twitter about one of them that was quite...
Oh yeah, the spinning bug.
It was pretty amusing bugs when you do get them, but one that is not very amusing is on Xbox Series consoles, cutscene playback in general is way worse than what you see on PlayStation 5, which is, it looks like it's performing badly, but it's actually just because the camera is not moving at a steady rate. So like in this scene here, if you watch the camera moving on Xbox Series X as it swings around, you can see it like stutter stopping constantly. The frame rate is...
it doesn't look good.
Frame rate's just perfectly fine here. It's just that the camera motion is non-linear.
Just for people that are still curious about this, I mean, when you say non-linear, it's really just... You would say camera for one frame would move like, we'll say, a couple centimeters, a small amount, but then the next frame it moves either more or less, right? So every other frame it's alternating the distance that the camera travels, which sort of manifests as a visible stutter, when really it should move at the same amount of distance for each frame to keep a smooth pan going.
Which is what you see on PlayStation 5. And we've seen this bug in other games before. I think Neo back in the day on PlayStation 4 had it when you'd move the camera around. And
yeah, well, that was specifically in the cinematic mode for some reason.
Oh, that was weird.
I hate that when this stuff happens.
I don't like it either, but luckily, at least, I say luckily, it's only found in cutscenes in this game at the moment and hopefully can be fixed. In general, playing this game, that kind of thing, there's also other bugs I've experienced while playing it. Like one that was actually semi-game breaking is where during the first raid mission, characters never disembarked from the ship and got stuck in motion there while kind of getting out, frozen in time, as you can see here, where they're just all kind of looks like they're moving but nothing's happening. And after this bug happened, every single time I swung my melee weapon, it didn't do any damage for the first hit. So if I was playing this game at a higher difficulty, for example, and all of my first hits, no matter what, never did damage, I would probably end up dying quite a lot. I had to end up restarting the game to have it not be doing this bug anymore. So your mileage may vary. There's going to be some visual inconsistencies that you may see across all platforms, and maybe some other gameplay breaking bugs, but that's kind of where it's at the moment. Xbox Series X performing at its worst 15% slower than PlayStation 5 at the same resolution in areas where they're both kind of underperforming a little bit, which is, I don't think that's very good for Xbox Series X when I look at it.
Oh, yeah, I tend to agree. And, so this is kind of a disappointing first effort in that regard.
One thing that's slightly disappointing, though, at the end, I think, as well, is that Xbox Series S is limited to just a 30 FPS mode. It has the exact same processor kind of essentially as the Xbox Series X, as well as, the same SSD setup. So I'm a little surprised that they didn't offer a 60 FPS mode for those who would like it, even if it is dipping resolution to sub 1080p. I think that's just some, in terms of gameplay, 60 FPS feels quite a lot better, especially when you go back and forth. When I played PlayStation 5, which was really great at hitting 60, and then going down to Xbox Series S, which was consistent 30 FPS, but it just felt so slow and looked so slow in comparison.
The main thing for me to take away here is just, it's a nice looking game, but I don't think it looks as good as Assassin's Creed Unity, which is still like kind of the high watermark, specifically the PC version. Like, it does have some issues with limited LOD draw distance, which can be distracting, but overall it's a beautiful game. I mean, cutscenes in Valhalla here, the hair rendering and the way the skin and everything looks, it's not really on par with Unity.
I do really enjoy the post-processing that they've added in here and all the things that the engine has added to itself over time, like the volumetric sky and the cool snow tessellation and things like that. But, that level of polish in terms of I would say, asset quality that we saw in Unity was pretty awesome.
I think that's just it's due to the fact that they moved to this large open world style game that happened with Origins. It just changed the way they could pull this off. But my only hope is that once they create true next gen games, like not cross gen, maybe we'll see a return to something like that. Maybe there's the headroom there, but then does that mean we'll be back down at 30 FPS on consoles? I don't know. We'll see.
John, thank you so much for joining me and talking to me about Assassin's Creed Valhalla on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series S, and Series X.
Wow, you had to get the whole thing in there. That's great.
I know, right?
Every single detail. That's how you roll. But yes, of course, thanks for having me. And I was interested to hear all your discoveries.
Yeah, thanks. And if you did enjoy this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support Digital Foundry on Patreon to get years worth of Digital Foundry content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me or John about Assassin's Creed Valhalla on any of these next-gen systems, write a comment below or follow John and myself on Twitter. And this is Alex saying ciao.
And Odin saying,
Skål.
Take care.